Well, I'm going to be speaking very definitely as a historian, not as an architect. I want to start by thanking Mark Jarzenbeck for opening up the issue of cultural nationalism last night. He did a lot of my work and saved me some of my 15 minutes. As a historian, I'm going to start for purposes of argument by assuming that we should try to write global histories of architecture. And if we make that assumption, then the obvious question is how? How should a global history be structured? Let me start first with a practical dilemma, and that is that we work from a literature and a canon created for cultural nationalist purposes. That is that the raw materials of our global histories are inherently anti-global in their intent. Up to this point, Mark and I agree, but there are two amplifications that I would make to some of the things he was saying last night. And the first is that I would expand the term cultural nationalism to encompass every sort of special pleading on behalf of a particular self-defined group, whether it be a nation, an ethnic group, an intellectual movement, or a profession. Any appeal to tradition broadly defined, whether any appeal to stylistic, aesthetic, or professional traditions, like ones to national, ethnic, or cultural traditions, is a variety of cultural nationalism. For example, the study of architectural history that treats the subject matter as coterminous with the works and concerns of architects, whether named or anonymous, is culturally nationalist. I'm always struck when I speak in architecture schools, or I suppose I'd say dismayed more than struck, by a discussion of history that treats only buildings made by architects. Or when I hear, as I did yesterday, that the new task of historians is to be architects' advocates, I see that as a very old and long discredited task of history. It makes me wonder, when history is discussed in this way, what happened to the last 50 years of cultural landscape studies? And I say that not as a populist, not as a vernacularist tourist, whatever that means, but to stress that the built environment is much broader than what architects do. And that even if one is primarily interested in architects, one has to take the entire landscape into account. There's no realm of architectural production that is hermetically sealed, either geographically, culturally, professionally, experientially, politically, to the extent that it can only refer to itself. One of my teachers was a folklorist named Henry Glassy, who wrote at one point, "Before they've been burdened with formal knowledge about architecture, architects' eyes have seen, their fingers have touched, their minds have inquired into the wholeness of their scenes. They have begun collecting scraps of experience without regard to the segregation of facts by logical class." Yet history in architecture schools often treats it as though it were the same thing as the so-called discipline of architecture. And this is why I say it's culturally nationalist. The national monuments, the culture heroes, are resuscitated over and over again. The same buildings, the same texts, the same names, and even if they're not treated as objects of unalloyed admiration, they're constants by which architects define their cultural identities. So one reason, perhaps, Mark pointed out last night, that national histories seem to stop with the advent of modernism, perhaps because the people who are writing it see modernism as a new national history that transcends them. What's harmful, I think, about cultural nationalisms of all sorts is this self-referential quality, the assumption that all meaning and all significance is to be found within the group. A second amplification I'd make to what was said last night, if cultural nationalism is, in all its forms, is a stumbling block to a global architectural history, it's nevertheless, I think, embedded in the fundamental methodological assumptions of architectural historians. It grows in some ways, out of architectural historians' continuing allegiance, sometimes open, sometimes not so open, to aesthetic criticism as part of their task. Since the 18th century, architectural historians have attempted to construct models of internally coherent difference. That is, to sort architecture into categories that correspond to discrete a priori abstractions such as culture, region, nation, tradition, building culture, professional agenda, or artistic persona. This attempt, in turn, rests on the assumption that an artifact is an authentic sign of something. So the Enlightenment origins, I think, of global histories of global histories of architecture originate in Enlightenment fascination with geographical, temporal, and cultural variety that in turn formed the basis of 19th century grand narratives, which we could say were truly master narratives based on culturally evolutionary models that were meant to legitimize cultural hierarchy, as Bob Fishman was saying at the beginning, and the notorious, widely despised tree of architecture is the inevitable example, but it's only one example. When we think about global histories, then we should think, for one thing, remember that there is an unbroken succession of them from the early 18th century to the present. But something has changed, I think, and I see the break happening around 1985 with the publication of Spiro Kostov's History of Architecture, Settings, and Rituals. Kostov's book is very much animated by the populist inclusiveness of the 60s and 70s. The impulse to tell the whole story, or the rest of the story, whatever that might be. In his preface, Kostov says, "Our appeal is for a more inclusive definition of architecture and consequently a more democratic view of architectural history. The aim is to put aside the invidious distinctions between architecture and building, to discriminate carefully among styles or conventions of form without discriminating against any of them, and to have a genuine respect for the architectural achievements of cultures regardless of their place of origin and their racial or theological identities." But I think that this new inclusiveness has the same problem as the older models. And as an example, I would raise David Carrier's recent essay, World Art History and Its Objects. And I turn to art history because I think art historians have thought about these issues at greater length than architectural historians to this point. Carrier argued that the central problem of art history, and I think we could say of architectural history as well, is to understand how an artist comes into and then modifies a tradition. For Carrier, then, the notion of tradition is essential to the entire enterprise. And at one point he said he divides all world art history into 4 traditions. Treating our 4 traditions as distinct, a plausible idealization is a necessary precondition for analysis. So having committed himself to this stability of traditions, despite acknowledging the fact that there is contact and exchange among them, Carrier concludes that there can be no universal monocultural history of art, no account telling the story of the developments in China, Europe, India, and Islam, those are his 4 traditions, 3 places and on religion, in one continuous story. Once we seriously study art from other cultures, then we have parallel stories. So the idea of the hierarchical master narrative of the 19th century has been replaced in the 20th century by the idea of parallel, equally important stories. And this is, if any of you have been to the architecture school at Tsinghua, in the lobby at either end you have, this is Liang Zicheng's creation. You have the notion that the Western classical architecture and what he called the Chinese order are parallel stories. It comes out of early 20th century work by the Japanese historian Ito Chuda. But the problem is that these new style inclusivist histories remain locked in the straitjacket of culture, of the idea of internally coherent difference, but they do so for opposite reasons for the old master narratives. That is, they're committed to, as Kostov would say, to cultural non-hierarchy. And this becomes a major sticking point for me. The problem with world histories or global histories, whatever you want to call them, of architecture to date is they've always been constructed around a concept of culture that I was going to say is reified, I would say is ossified. A concept that that requires one to explain historical change through either internal evolution, through external contamination, or more recently, terms like hybridization and syncretization nevertheless all of those terms are committed to this notion of internally coherent difference. But where the old master narrative model allowed you either to claim a kind of Fletcherian evolution or hierarchy, or simply to rule entire cultures out of bounds by focusing on the so-called Western tradition, cultural egalitarianism offers no model for change other than to take a large story and to divide it into many small parallel stories so that you get histories that are lists, organized by time, by space, by monument, by architect. I think there's a further problem with models based on this idea of culture, internally coherent difference, and it's one that I mentioned earlier in connection with architectural culture, and that is that architectural production is not a closed system. Perhaps it's not a system at all, although architects and historians and theorists often try to make it a system for their own reasons. If it's not a system, it's hard to accord it a coherent identity of a sort that underpins the rhetorics of tradition of all sort, whether aesthetic or craft, national, cultural, professional. Because architectural forms and architectural spaces are not genetically determined, they're thoroughly mutable, they're transposable, they're borrowable without loss of legibility. But the legibility that they have is always situational rather than inherent. John Boardman, a classical historian, wrote a book called The Diffusion of Classical Art in Antiquity. He writes that his book explores how ancient non-Greek cultures reacted to Greek art, what they thought important and borrowable from it. Their reactions were determined by their needs, opportunities, excuse me, and for many, and not least by the idioms of their native arts. So far, so good, but then he says that his book is about the reception of art without understanding, falling back on this appeal to the authenticity of the object. The phrase that I like to use as a way around this is circles of knowledge, and that is that any building lies at the intersection of varying numbers of overlapping but not identical circles of knowledge. And that may have to do with things such as the intersection of professional and artisanal struggles for position, spatial patterns arising out of social interactions, formal vocabularies, or it might arise from the intersection of local craft practices or the availability and expense of materials, new ideas derived from publications or from other kinds of sources, social hierarchies and rivalries and so on. These diagrams are not meant to be exhaustive. They're mainly exhaustive of my capacities, my graphic capacities, but very simplified and suggestive. Any building can exist in multi-dimensional intersections of many circles or maybe spheres. This, I think, has at least three potential implications for our understanding of architectural change. And one is decenteredness, and I use this very tired word to suggest that we can't think of architectural traditions that have birthplaces or centers. Cultural hearths, geographers call them, or metropoli, as other kinds of historians sometimes like to talk about. This diffusionist model long ago was rejected by anthropologists and archaeologists. Each place is its own center, and that's so that the center, as we look internationally, is constantly moving around the human cultural surface of the earth. It depends on where you are. The metaphor I like is a moving average from statistics. The second is that the lack of center illuminates the problem of the idea of borrowed meanings of architectural forms being understood or misunderstood, as Boardman mentioned. A better way to think about architecture is through the ordinariness or extraordinariness of visual images. The adoption of outside elements is always in terms of local meanings and significance. The third is circles of history. We can expand the numbers and scale of circles of knowledge to almost any dimension without constructing grand narratives or parallel stories. A new generation of world historians offers a third way, the interest in webs and flows rather than linear chains of cause and effect is not just something applicable to the modern era. These historians are arguing that at the global scale, new questions have to be asked and they have to be answered in new ways. Eric Lane Martin argues that the questions of world historians are qualitatively different from the kinds of questions asked by historians who focus on particular areas, that they look at large-scale overlapping historical processes. This implies that a global architectural history can't simply be a compendium of regional or nationally based or culturally based histories, that it has to be grounded in the understanding that localities are suspended in large-scale matrix. I think that differs from both Bannister, Fletcher, and Kostoff, and that emphasizes tradition. This is not a kind of global architectural history that would be all-inclusive, that would be symmetrical, would tell stories that suit the agendas of a nation or an ethnic group or a profession. And I'll just leave you with the comment that I think that there are ways that perhaps we can discuss that this may conflict very directly with the pedagogical agendas of architecture schools. Thank you.